Hey, this is Khan, you're watching Ninja Pulls. When we play games with big combat systems, one of our most valuable weapons is objectivity. Think about it, a good game is inherently engaging. We get invested, excited, but when things are complex or challenging, we can also get frustrated, arrogant, defensive. Happens all the time. And the more we like a game, the easier it happens. So much of the weird behavior we've seen in live service games, good groups ruined by stupid drama, or players furiously defending build choices which are fundamentally, often comedically misjudged, it's usually a loss of objectivity. This is a hidden benefit of ESO logs. As a tool for cold analysis and optimization, it's indispensable to the raiding community. Nerd culture is about passion as well as facts. And when a group of people are trying to achieve something tricky in a game and have fun at the same time, it's so nice to be able to strip away that passion, the adrenaline and ego, and look at things statistically, dispassionately. Without it, ESO's raiding scene would be much more prickly. But enough pop psychology, the point of this video is to help you use logs to analyze and improve your performance in ESO. It has been a very popular request for a while now, so I hope it delivers. And by the way, if you can suggest other guides that would be popular and helpful to the community, let us know. For those who don't know it, ESOlogs.com is a free tool run by Archon, which can record any fight in ESO and break it down to numbers and statistics so you can make an objective assessment about what's going on. The functionality is deep and we don't have time to show everything, but let's start with how to look at other groups' logs for inspiration, how to analyze your own fights, how to troubleshoot issues you're having, and finally how to record your logs if nobody else is doing it. The most basic thing is to see other players' setups, but do yourself a favor and don't just copy something without considering the context. The best setup depends on the strat being used, the fight time, the group we're with, and let's face it, our own execution as well. A setup that worked great in one context might suck in another, so it's not just monkey see, monkey do. Select the trial, rankings, then a specific boss fight, hard mode or non-hard mode, whichever one you're building for. Pick a class and you get a list of all the fights recorded in the current patch, ranked by DPS. If you've specified a class and a fight, each name will have a drop down so you can see a snapshot of what they used. Don't just look at the top performers, it's often a good idea to check fight time as well and look for clears in the same ballpark as yours. It's not a perfect system. A great player in an average group may appear below an average player in a great group. Faster clears mean higher numbers for everyone in that group, and that skews the picture. Then again, some bosses keep spawning adds on a timer, think Captain Vrol in Kind's Aegis, so slower groups can actually get more damage as more and more enemies keep pouring into the fight. That's obviously not something you want to copy. Boss damage is usually what matters, and to isolate that, click on the character in question and you'll see the damage done tab for that group in that fight. Top left, click the all enemies drop down and select the dark cloak icon at the bottom, which signifies boss damage. The scamp icon next to it is damage to NPCs, also known as ads or trash. This is a great way to cut the crap when looking at logs where cleave damage is ultimately incidental. Still, it's fair to say this list is superficial and not completely objective. It's just a snapshot. We gotta use our brains to add context to the numbers we see. There is usually a general meta that the community settles on for a given fight. And if you want to find out what that is, this is a great place to start. Just don't expect miracles. Use logs to get ideas, but even the best ideas are worthless unless we implement them properly. If a listing says leaderboard, there are either no logs for that fight, or more likely they're private because it's a group that's pushing score and doesn't want to share its secrets. These sometimes become public later, but anything that says log next to it is available right now. You can open that fight and find the specific player you want to look at. It always opens on the damage done tab by default. By the way, if it comes up in another language, look to the top right and click translate. Click on the character name, select summary, and you can see almost everything about their setup. Gear, abilities, enchantments, traits, where their damage is coming from, as well as incoming sources of damage and healing. If you didn't specify a boss fight in your initial search, it will open on the last boss of that trial by default. To see a different fight from the same log, use the top left drop down and you can see the entire log with every fight, which can contain multiple runs or even multiple different trials. You can even look at individual trash pulls if you want. If some details like gear do not appear in the summary tab, the log may be corrupted, or if it's Zorin in Lucent Citadel, what you want to do is open the fight selection menu again and find the Zorin encounter under the trash section. Not exactly sure why that works, but it does. You will not see food on the summary tab. You'll have to go to the buffs tab for that and look under defensive buffs or healing buffs. It's usually under one of those. But if you're struggling to find it, you can hit Ctrl F and try to find the food buff manually by typing in part of the name like Lavafoot Soup, Ghastly Eyeball, or just the primary resource if they're using max stat food. If you're still struggling, there are several third-party tools that summarize the mass of data from logs. Taste of Blood, for instance, have a very nice one that some of my buddies use. It won't show you everything, just the basic stuff it assumes you're interested in. Other things you won't be able to see easily on logs are champion point or the exact scripts used on scribed abilities. The focus script is obvious from the name of the ability. Shattering banner means multi-target focus, fiery banner means dot focus, and if you're not sure what the name means, go to a scribing altar and check. You can also comb through the buff section to try and figure out what's being used, like the Exploiter CP for example. Pro tip, you can look at damage done and use the filters along the top to isolate a scribed ability and see what other damage types accompany it. That can tell you if the signature script is something like Assassin's Misery, for example. But with a lot of CPs and scripts, you'll just have to fill in the blanks using your head, which is easy enough for groups that have all the typical buffs and debuffs. But if you run with a lot of random pickup groups, you might struggle to find logs which match your specific group composition. Also, it's obvious that when the most enthusiastic damage dealers look at logs to see what's best, then replicate it and post their own logs with that setup, confirmation bias will start to emerge. One single setup can start to dominate to the point where inexperienced players might believe there's no other way to do things. That's almost never true, there are always alternatives, it's just that the best options tend to float organically to the top. So we don't need to get too hung up on what's considered meta. Logs are user data, not gospel, and the gap between one setup and another might not be as wide as it seems. But equally, don't go the other way, stick your fingers in your ears and pretend that the meta doesn't exist, or that you're not wasting people's time by bringing weak game to co-op content. That's not cool. Be a good MMO citizen and pull your weight. It's that simple, and logs make it very easy to check that we're doing it. If we are, then so long as everyone's enjoying themselves and meeting shared goals, it's all good. That's all pretty obvious and maybe I don't need to say it, but there it is. So we know how to see other setups and get ideas, but how do we judge how well a setup is working or analyze our own performance? The process is pretty much the same for both. The best place to start is with the others in your group, since they were in the same fight with the same conditions as you. Head to damage done and see how it stacks up. Remember, you can toggle it to just show boss damage if that's helpful. Then click on your character, you'll see that in the top left corner, instead of all sources, it now shows your character name. You can change that to anyone in the group. Character names, class and role are listed on the left, while usernames are listed on the right. This is going to be the main method you use to see player-specific data. There is another way we'll come back to in a minute. Damage done is obvious. It lists every source of damage done by that player in that fight. Abilities, gear set procs, even synergies from other group members that they've taken. This helps you see past the tooltip of a set or a skill and get a sense of how powerful it really is. Occasionally, this can be surprising. I'm forever finding Dragonknight players who are amazed by their burning talons and the sheer amount of damage it does, especially in multi-target fights. Or Arcanists who are stunned by the power of Azure Blight when it's used correctly. They obviously know these things are good because they're running them, but sometimes seeing the numbers and ratios on screen helps that understanding finally click into place. This is where your damage is coming from. You can look at other players with the same class in the same group to see if their ratios are different. Maybe logs will show that they prioritize their backbar dot better than you do, or that they're using a different morph. Sometimes it's just better crit luck. Making comparisons with other groups is harder since conditions are different, but you can always try. The process is exactly the same, and you can open a separate window to look at things side by side or use the compare function, which does the same thing in a single window. Going back to damage done, one of the things it's good to investigate is how much damage and uptime you're getting from a proc set. Popular opinion is unfortunately often wrong about what works and doesn't work. Take Reliquien. We are always told it's a dummy set that doesn't work on real bosses. Well, here's Teleria hard mode, about as real as you can get, and a Necro using Reliquien. With that player selected, in damage done, click the proc to see all the damage it did to all targets. We don't care about the behemoth, just the boss, so click on her, and you'll see that the set dealt a pretty consistent 13k DPS across 3 minutes. It is a long, single target fight, exactly the kind of fight where Reliquien shines, but still, 13k? Do not trust the gossip. Look up some examples in logs and see if it works for yourself. Objectivity. While we're here, what about Corpse Burster? Same again, back to damage done, and we can see this dealt 17.3k to the boss, plus nearly 5k to behemoths. Again, you can use the boss versus NPC filter to isolate the damage you're interested in. Pro tip, once you isolate a damage source, you'll always see this graph, and if there are dips or gaps, you can zoom in on the graph to isolate that time frame and try to figure out why. More on that in a moment. Another pro tip, remember that procs can also trigger status effects, and that's often where quite a lot of their value comes from. Zaan, Runecarver or Selene, for example. It's not enough to look just at the proc damage itself, but the extra status effect damage from burning or sundered or whatever it is. What about sets that don't deal damage directly? They can still be tracked if they apply some sort of buff or effect. The Harpooner's Wading Kilt, for example. You click the Buffs tab, and here's where you see everything like Powerful Assault uptimes, Major Slayer, Minor Berserk, Ozazan, whatever. There's a lot, and if you search for the kilt, you'll only see the effect of the mythic being equipped. That's not helpful, but on the tooltip, the effect is called Hunter's Focus, and if you search for that, you've got it. 99.5% uptime. Even better, click on it and you can see the actual stacks. In this case, this player did take some direct damage and lose stacks 3 times, but max stacks uptime is still very high, so this is a fight where the kilt worked great. Yolnahkrin hard mode, by the way. Stuff like this where the kilt works and doesn't work is pretty well known by now, but if you ever want to check for sure, now you know exactly how to do it. Other sets with buffs and effects are much the same. For Kinraz's Wrath, look for Major Berserk, for Highland Sentinel, look for Sentinel's Eye, etc. By the way, the Combat Metrics add-on does some of this stuff too, if you remember to save it or look at it right after the fight. Logs just offer a much larger directory that you can go back to months later if necessary. Of course, there are also effects that don't go on us, but on the target. We'll come back to that in a moment, but first, some other quick ways to check how you're doing. One of the most obvious but overlooked is your tooltip damage. How much damage do you get from each Fate Carver tick or Blastbone's explosion or Molten Whip? This is important. Your gameplay could be awesome, but if the tooltips are limp, it's not going to do you much good. Open damage done and look at the average hit alongside the percentage of crits and see if yours is a bit too low. Average hit is per target, while average cast is the damage on all targets, so in crowded fights this can go crazy high on something like Blastbones. Again, it's easier if you have a benchmark to check against, maybe find one in the rankings view we saw earlier. Just be realistic, DDs at the top of that list are going to have better buffs and uptimes, but at least you'll get a sense of what you're missing. By the way, checking tooltip values is something healers should also do, to make sure all of their hot ticks and burst heals are nice and chunky. Too often, healers build for sustain, making their tooltips feeble and their job more difficult. The real secret is usually not to spam burst heals, but to have really thick healing values on everything you do. Then layer 3 or 4 hots which are constantly ticking for 3k, 4k each, and use your burst heals to top them off. If that isn't working, low tooltip values might be why, and you can diagnose that here. Next, check your number of casts during the fight. This is often used as a shorthand for how good you are at the game. It's not quite that simple, and it can be hard to judge. Obviously, the more casts per minute, the better. But casts on this list include not just abilities, but synergies taken, bar swaps, light attacks, so a bar swappy Necro is going to have way more casts per minute than an Arcanist or a Rojo healer. What you want to do is look for other players doing the same job as you. If your casts per minute are much lower than theirs, you should look into this. Again, DDs who go back to the dummy every few months should already know how fast they're going, but healers can often be blissfully unaware of how slow their casts are, because it's a metric which is kinda hidden away, but it is impactful and it can massively improve or lower your performance, so check it. Buffs are also very important in determining damage, but we'll cover that properly in the next section. To see how they're affecting you at a basic level, check the list of buffs to see if you're getting the uptimes you expect. If not, figure out why. A lot of Arcanists like to stand behind the healers, for example. Pro tip, you can check positioning with the replay section at the very top right. Press play on the bottom left and you can watch the entire fight. You'll usually have to zoom in to be able to see everything properly. Also, you can find the character you want to focus on and click on it to highlight it, then you can see a whole bunch of attacks, buffs and debuffs coming and going in real time. It also helps you keep track of them in the stack, and you can select an enemy and see which way they're facing. Positioning is often underrated. It's always messier than you think, and this replay function is a very good way to see if we're missing something. We can't fix it if we don't know about it. Alongside the replay section, there's also rankings, which we can ignore for now, and the compare function, which I already mentioned. That's handy if you want to see side-by-side uptimes between two tanks on the same boss, for example. But analyze and occasionally replay are probably going to be the main ones we use. Back to analyze, there's also the deaths tab, which is pretty self-explanatory. If you're one of the highest on that list, you might want to do something about that. You can also check damage taken to see if you're getting more than your fair share of hits and what's hitting you. If there's a suspicious looking attack in there, click on it to see where it came from. And if you think the tanks are turning the boss into the group, we just saw how to check that in replay. Or if you think they're losing taunt, you can verify that by going to the threat tab, selecting the enemy and seeing who had aggro in that moment. And finally, of course, healing, to see where your heals are coming from or not. There's a very important toggle here on the right, overheal. This refers to the healing you received while at full health, so it didn't do anything, but it was there. Absorbs toggle shields in and out of the equation, things like barrier and warding contingency. Not the same as healing, but sometimes just as valuable. There's no right or wrong way to look at these stats. I'd suggest taking a look with and without absorbs and overheals, just to get a better sense of the actual healing that's going on. Otherwise, it can be easy for an Arcanist healer with Chakram shields or a healer on barrier duty to make the other one look lazy, when in fact, it's just the shields throwing the numbers off. Those are the main things. I don't want to go into more detail because it's a deep rabbit hole and the video could be 2 hours long if we're not careful. And I bet some of you are thinking, geez, I'm not going to spend time looking at all this stuff, I just want to do trials with my friends. I get that, time is precious, which is why I made this video, to make it quicker and easier for you to find the info you need. But also, I've been in enough trial groups, both super chill and super organized, to know that 10 minutes spent looking at logs can save you hours of time in-game. That's the way you want to look at this. But ultimately, the best way to learn logs is to play around with them. So when you do have time, open up a log, doesn't have to be yours, click on a bunch of things and see what happens. How do you think the rest of us learned how to use it? Okay, we've looked a lot at the individual character level, but what if you want to zoom out and analyze the entire fight from a group perspective? Well, it's pretty much the same bag of tricks, we just have to start looking more at enemy stats. Start with a debuff like Zenkosh, for example. I just made a video on the enormous influence this set has on group damage. That's linked in the description if you want to see it when we're done here. Find the Zenkosh DD, usually a Dragonknight sitting near the bottom of the damage list. Click on them and look at their summary to make sure they're wearing the set. Zenkosh does show up in damage, but that's not why we use it. We're interested in the debuff, so click the debuffs tab. Initially, we're still looking at a player, so it shows debuffs on them. We don't care about that, we want to see the debuffs they applied, not the debuffs they received. There are two ways to change this. You can toggle between friendlies and enemies on the top left, then select the boss to see debuffs applied to the boss. Or you can go to the top right where it says gained by friendly and select cast by friendly instead. These two drop-downs on the left and right are how you navigate and isolate the vast majority of stuff on ESO logs. In basically every case, you're specifying a source and a target, whether that's damage, buffs, healing, whatever. In this case, I'd use Cast by Friendly on the top right. Since we're already looking at the Zenkosh DD, there's Roar of Alkosh, which is the dot from the proc, plus Line Breaker, which is the actual debuff. The two should be the same, but for whatever reason, they're sometimes slightly off. Doesn't matter, it's 95% either way, which is awesome. You can check additional targets as well if you want. If one elite ad took a long time to die, for example, maybe they weren't getting hit by Alkosh. But while we're at it, let's look at Zen. Unfortunately, the Touch of Zen debuff doesn't show stacks, but if you look at the other debuffs here in this list, you can see the uptimes on sticky dots that were applied to the target, which is pretty much the same thing. If you've got 5 sticky dots over 80%, you're in good shape. To see all debuffs applied to that target by the entire group, not just by one player, click the X next to the character name and the list will expand dramatically. Or click Enemies on the top left, select the boss, and make sure the drop-down on the right says Gained by Enemy. There's so much on this list that it's a bit much to take in, so you can use Ctrl F in your browser to find a specific debuff by name, or use the drop-down where it says All Abilities. Stagger is a good example of something we can check in this way. Some of the more common debuffs with a lot of potential sources, like Minor Breach or Minor Vulnerability, they can appear in this list multiple times, so it's usually easier to find those from the debuffs overview list. For example, we don't really care where Minor Vulnerability or Off Balance comes from so long as the target gets it. But if you are curious, click on it and you can see the various sources throughout the fight. And if uptimes are low, you can do something about it. For example, if off balance is below 15%, get your supports to focus on this more, or tell the DDs not to bother with Exploiter. If you've got multiple triggers of off balance, a good trick is to select off balance immunity instead. This makes it a little easier to read. Then go back to off balance itself if you're more interested in knowing who applied it each time. With tanks that are still learning, it's often worth doing this with the Crusher enchantment. It's a pretty important factor for group damage, but it's one of the first things that tanks let slip. You probably don't even need to say anything, just screenshot that percentage, and anyone with a tanking mindset is going to be horrified to see unsatisfactory uptimes and fix it immediately. There's another cool trick I'm going to show you if you want to see a debuff alongside something else. Select one like Major Vulnerability and click the plus at the end of the uptime row. Then it'll be added as a sticky element at the top of your table. Then click another tab like Damage Taken and you can see how those burst phases line up. Or go back to debuffs and select something else like Off Balance and see maybe if your burst phases are a little late. This is very min-maxy, but it's a very cool trick and it's there if you want it. You can make a lot of things sticky like that if you need to see something side by side. Just click the X when you're done. And that's pretty much it for debuffs. Other good ones to check include Minor Brittle, Major Maim, Weakening Enchantments, etc. We already looked at buffs, but to check these group-wide, you want to select Friendlies and the Buffs tab. Again, the list is very long and don't necessarily trust the numbers you see on this page. Remember, they're group-wide, so when Powerful Assault says 98%, that doesn't mean everyone had 98% uptime, just that for 98% of the fight, at least someone had the buff. To see the individual numbers, click on it first. Again, this could be about positioning. If there's a DD with lower uptimes than everyone else, why aren't they getting it? Other good ones to check here are Major Resolve, Major Slayer, Major Courage, Major Brutality and Sorcery if you've got a DK running Igneous Weapons. Also, don't forget about sustain buffs like Minor Intellect and Endurance, and so on. There are loads of things you can check here, and all of them have some influence on group power, so if you find that several are getting low uptimes, there's potentially a lot of power you can gain by passing that information onto the supports. Much of this is the same stuff we already covered, same with healing and damage taken. You look at these group-wide the same way you do individually. And finally, damage spread. If you're a raid lead or even just part of a trial team, it's up to you to maintain a sensible perspective on this stuff. It's just a game and we want to be chill. Having said that, one of the worst things you can have in a group is a wide damage spread. A big gap between those dealing the most damage and those dealing the least damage. Support DDs are different, that's fine. But if you've got 2 or 3 DDs always doing the lion's share of damage in every trial, they can start to resent it. And if that comes across to the rest of the group, the other DDs might start to have a shit time. If people are learning, then obviously give them a proper chance. And never let the DDs shit talk one another. Logs are there to help us be objective, not give us ammunition to use against our teammates. What you can do is encourage everyone to look at logs so they at least know what's up. People will always naturally scrutinize their own performance most of all, and once they realize they're not pulling their weight, they may automatically take steps to fix it. And if they're not very good with logs, hey, post a link to this video in your group chat. What about troubleshooting problems? Take deaths as an example. Why did that character die? Add-ons like improved death recap can help, but we can also figure it out with logs. The deaths tab shows who died, at what time, the killing blow, and the last 3 hits. If we need more than that, go to the resources tab and select the character who died from the all friendlies dropdown. Make sure health is the resource that's selected, then click and drag to zoom in on when they died, shown by that red line. Adjust the time frame so you're looking at the period when their health goes from full to empty for a visual representation of what happened. By the way, you can click reset zoom anytime to get back to the whole fight. While we're zoomed in, we will only see data from this time frame, not just on the graph but everywhere. This is where the events view is super useful. It shows a list of everything that occurred in that time window, every tick of damage and healing, incoming and outgoing. That's why we gotta zoom right in, because even in 5 seconds, there might be thousands of little events that happen. If you click the damage taken and healing tabs, you'll notice the top left drop-down changes from all friendlies to all sources. That's because damage and healing come from different places. If we're looking at damage taken, we want to select the friendly who died to see what hit them. But if we're looking at healing received, we want to click the X and make sure that top drop-down menu is blank, and instead use the drop-down menu below it to select the same friendly who died. Otherwise, we'll only see the healing that they did to themselves, and we might get the wrong idea that our healers aren't doing anything. It's not a good look if you start blaming the wrong people, so always make sure you're using the correct filters. And if you're not sure, then maybe just toggle between different ones to check that you're seeing the right information. If damage taken shows that character taking hits that shouldn't be on them, mystery solved. If damage looks pretty normal, but there aren't enough heals alongside it, mystery solved. Make sure absorbs are toggled on as well. If you're still not sure what went wrong, look at the buffs tab and see if major resolve is missing. And if there are several sources of resolve, remember to do a Ctrl F and check all of them. Sometimes what looks like downtime is actually just a buff overriding itself from another source. Major evasion is another good one to check if there's a lot of incoming AoE damage. Any survivability buffs that should be active, minor resolve, Ozazan, minor toughness, they all make some difference. Remember all of these tricks. Looking at the resources tab, not just health, you can check stamina as well for DDs using Riptide, or Magicka for healers using Pearls of Elnafay. The events view to see exactly what happened tick by tick in that time frame. And the buffs tab for a quick overview and a way to troubleshoot common problems. All 3 of these can be used to track down and diagnose all sorts of issues that you or your group might be having. Sometimes it's a matter of combining 2 tricks to figure out exactly what's gone wrong. For example, use the buffs tab to see who isn't getting PA or pillager's profit, then the replay function to see if their positioning is to blame. Finally, if nobody else is logging your fights and you need to do it, all you gotta do is type in your chat window in-game /encounter log, and the game will say encounter log enabled and start logging all combat from that point on. Until you repeat that command, then it will say encounter log disabled and stop. It's the game itself that does all of this, so we wouldn't be able to do any of this stuff if ZOS didn't want us to. But in order to read and share the data you've collected, you'll need to install the uploader. Head to esologs.com and click download client. Installation is simple, just follow the instructions. You'll need to create an account or borrow somebody else's. That's free, but you can upgrade to various other tiers if you want to support Archon and what they do. When your trial or whatever is about to start, you can activate the encounter log in-game and either upload the file later when it's finished, or you can press live log, which uploads each fight as it finishes with a slight delay, so people can check the logs during the session after each wipe, for example, which is very useful. Be sure to name it before you start or you won't know which is which, and once you've started live logging, click view report to go to the live log and share the link to it on Discord or wherever you and your group congregate. If you upload the log later, do the same. If you're logged in on the website itself, you can choose to make the report private, so nobody can look it up without permission and it won't show up in rankings unless that run makes it onto the leaderboard. You can make logs public or private anytime you want. You can delete them from your PC once they're uploaded, or you can split them after the upload if you've accidentally merged several trials into one. There's loads you can do, but I think I've covered everything you need to know to get started. So, start playing around with logs, even if you don't really need to, just so you're familiar. Then when you do need to figure out why your group isn't cruising through content the way it should, you can ride to the rescue instead of saying, I don't know. So, this has been another community-requested video from Ninja Pulls. We want to do lots more of these, but ultimately it comes down to how many people watch them. So please share, get the word out to all the players you can. Hey, there's this great new guide which will actually help you improve and advance by yourself. I also need to ask for your support, whatever you're able and inclined to give to help us keep this resource growing. And I need to thank all those wonderful people who already support Ninja Pulls on Twitch, YouTube and Ko-fi. We are super grateful. Thanks for watching, may the bosses and trifectas fall before you, and I'll see you in the next one.